Welcome to It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 83. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from 1870 to 1930. And in this episode, I will be talking about part 2 of the investigation by the Select Committee of the Illinois State Legislature looking into professional boxing and wrestling in Chicago, Illinois. In part 2, we look at the revelations that made the Billy Sandow management promotional group, and by extension Ed Strangler Lewis, look bad in 1927. But first I wanted to start with a few updates. The first update is today is March 30th, which is my baby girl's birthday. So I wanted to say happy birthday to my daughter, Katie Lee. Daddy loves you, and I hope you had a day that's as wonderful as you are. Last week I had talked about a television show that I said I might make a recommendation on. I had to tap out on it. So Heels, it had a lot of things going for it, which you would think it would be a show that I would like, but I just couldn't get past the characters that I could not like, root for, appreciate, and there wasn't anybody in the whole show I found that I could really root for. So I had to tap out on that particular show, but I did want to make a recommendation for a show that I've just started to watch the second episode on, but it is called Le Cage. It's also on Netflix, and it is an MMA-based show, which is it's a French show, and as people that follow MMA know, for a long time, because of the power of the Judo Association in France, France has the second most storied judo national team in the world. They've won the most gold medals behind Japan. Their association was so powerful, it kept MMA out of France a lot longer than it did most other countries. But in the last couple of years, particularly through the popularity of fighters like Cyril Gane, MMA is now legal in France. There is a big group of French fighters in all of the major companies. This show was made, obviously, with the cooperation of UFC, because there's a number of UFC people in it. So far, what I've seen in 2 episodes is excellent. So give Le Cage a try. I also have kind of a recommendation that's not anything to do with combat sports history, but I've written 8 or 9 books on St. Louis history. St. Louis history is always going to be a love of mine. There is a movie, a documentary, about 2 hours long on Amazon Prime called The Color of Medicine. And it is the story of the Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which was the largest African-American hospital in the United States, and its residency and nursing program. There was 5 professional schools there, and the graduates from these residencies and that not only staffed a lot of medical offices in St. Louis, but all over the United States. And it was in operation from 1937 to 1979. So if you're interested at all in history or local history, the history of medicine, I would recommend The Color of Medicine, the story of the Homer G. Phillips Hospital. It's got a lot of interesting things, particularly if you're into St. Louis history. I have a sad thing to report this week, and that was that I just heard that Bill Mercer, who was the longtime play-by-play announcer on World Class Championship Wrestling, had passed away this past week or two at the age of 99. You hear a lot of people talk about the voice of their childhood was Jim Ross. Well, I was almost an adult the first few times I heard Jim Ross. Jim Ross wasn't the voice of my childhood. The voice of my childhood was originally Larry Matisick, who was the play-by-play announcer on Wrestling at the Chase, and unfortunately we lost Larry close to 10 years ago now. Maybe it has been 10 years. That's one of the great regrets I have. I wasn't writing combat sports history yet around the time that he passed away. My cousin had an opportunity to talk with him at some of the local wrestling shows that he went to, But I never got the chance to talk to Larry Matysik, and I would have loved to talk to him and just to thank him, because listening to him talk about professional wrestling history during the Wrestling at the Chase broadcasts is what got me interested in researching wrestling history one day. And then the second voice was Bill Mercer. Wrestling at the Chase went off the air in 1983 when I was just a kid. World Class was kind of the wrestling program that the St. Louis promotion replaced it with initially. World Class was a great wrestling show, and Bill Mercer was the voice of that. And so many of the best matches that I saw on World Class Championship Wrestling, Bill Mercer was the voice behind all that. And Bill has done a lot of interviews over the last 15 or 20 years that shed a lot of light on what was going on in the promotion back then, and just seemed like a true gentleman. He was not primarily a wrestling announcer. He was a news reporter in Dallas, Texas, very famous one. And he actually broke the news of the Kennedy assassination. And I believe he had the first interview with Lee Harvey Oswald after all of that occurred. Bill Mercer might have been the one that told him he was being charged with Kennedy's murder. You know, wrestling was just a very small part of what he did in his life. Well, I think I'm going to kind of transition into the main content here. I don't want to follow up Bill Mercer's passing with anything else right now. Last week, we had started the discussion about how in June of 1927, the Illinois State Legislature impaneled a select committee to look into professional boxing and professional wrestling in Chicago and to investigate the Chicago Athletic Commission. While they did not find anything really wrong with what the Chicago Athletic Commission did, they did find some serious issues with the conduct of the promoters of both professional boxing and professional wrestling. One of the people who gave testimony was William Demetrol, who had been a professional wrestler since the late 1900s, early 19-teens, and he had actually defeated Ed Strangler Lewis for the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in Kentucky in 1913. However, by the time that they're doing this investigation in 1927, Lewis is sitting at the top of the sport, and William Demetrol is a fairly well-known national wrestler who would be brought in to lose to up-and-coming people. He is nowhere near the main event at this point in time in his career. Demetrol testified before a committee that promoters forced him to put up a $5,000 guarantee and give a quitclaim deed to his Chicago home as a guarantee that Demetrol would not double-cross Lewis and try to throw Lewis in their 1924 world title matches. The promoter in Chicago, who I think was Ed White at the time, booked Demetrol to wrestle 2 matches with Lewis. The first one was going to be a bit controversial to set up the second one. To keep Demetrol from double-crossing Lewis and shooting on him, they made him put up the $5,000 in the quitclaim deed to his house. It's easy to dismiss these claims in 1927 because Lewis could easily crush Demetrol in a legitimate contest at this time. If Demetrol had tried anything with Lewis, Lewis probably would have walked the dog on him and just beat him senseless and left him in the ring. However, you have to understand, Ed Lewis is not making the arrangements for these bouts. These bouts are being arranged by the promoter and Billy Sandow, who was Lewis's manager. And Billy Sandow had an unnatural fear of people shooting on Lewis. For whatever reason, he didn't understand most people were never going to be able to get the better of Lewis in a contest. Despite that, when Marin Plastina started making his challenge to Lewis in 1921 and 1922, Billy Sandow never let Lewis wrestle Plastina, although it's quite likely that Lewis would have defeated Plastina. Lewis never felt Plastina was on his level. John the Nebraska Tigerman Pesek handled Plastina pretty easily in their shoot contest in 1921. However, Sandow, being a naturally cautious person, it is not inconceivable that Sandow made Demetrol put up to $5,000 in his house to secure the two-match series, and the fact that he wouldn't try to double-cross Lewis. However, when Sandow testified to the select committee, he dismissed Demetrol's charges and offered to have Lewis defeat Demetrol in a wrestling contest to prove the allegations to be false whenever the committee would like to watch the match. Sandow thought that this would kind of put an end to the claims. However, Claude Roux, who was state representative from Harrisburg, Illinois, announced that he would introduce a bill in the Illinois legislature to ban professional wrestling in Illinois. So the committee was taking this very seriously. And the testimony was damaging enough that Chicago promoter James Mullen canceled the Friday, June 10th, 1927 match between Lewis and Joe Malsowitz, which had been being built up for months. When the promoter saw how damaging these allegations in this committee were, he told the committee that the revelations on professional wrestling at Monday's legislative committee meeting were such that I do not feel that I can retain any further interest in wrestling promotion in this state until the many charges are proved false, if that can be done. So this canceled a very lucrative bout between Lewis and Malsowitz, which actually I think it's Malkowitz, Joe Malkowitz, that had been talked about for several months and that promoters had been bidding on because Malkowitz was one of the few people that Lewis had not wrestled yet. One of the odder things I found about this is the committee also discovered missing tickets, unclear record keeping, and evidence of financial impropriety that may have hidden money promoters should have paid taxes on. You would have thought they would have jumped on that, but they showed reluctance to pursue this line of questioning too deeply. And it came out later that the Chicago promoters might have been paying off politicians who the Illinois state legislature didn't really want to expose to public scrutiny over taking money from the wrestling promoters. So they just kind of let that slide by the wayside and instead suspended 130 professional boxers and wrestlers during the course of their investigation, which is highly unfair when you think about it. Besides the Demetrol allegations, insiders testified that Lewis and Rafael Grena rehearsed their match in a gym before wrestling in public. Demetrol revealed that Billy Sandow and former Chicago promoter Ed White controlled all the wrestling in Illinois, which other people had alleged as well. Sandow also managed the majority of Lewis's opponents. Sandow denied these accusations, even though they were all true. Sandow had been managing Lewis's opponents for years and wouldn't let people that were not part of that group wrestle Lewis, particularly after the double cross of Wayne Munn. Paul Pulaski, who was the manager of Hans Stanky, claimed Lewis and Sandow refused to wrestle Stanky. J.C. Ole Marsh, the manager of Marin Plastina, made the same charge. Plastina had defeated Lewis earlier in Lewis's career. Marsh said he could not secure a rematch when Lewis became a nationally known champion. Sandow, frustrated by all these allegations, finally just responds in frustration that he does not promote matches. He is a manager, which is partly true. He controlled and booked a lot of the wrestlers, and he controlled the outcomes of matches a lot of times. And Sandow also said that the promoters did not put up the required bonus to secure a match with Stanky. Sandow said he would not do business with Ole Marsh, a known trimmer. This is actually true too. Ole Marsh had a bad reputation in a business full of people with bad reputations. In 1909, Marsh had pled guilty to helping stage prearranged matches as part of a nationwide gambling ring. Demetrol had also been charged with the same thing in Chicago in 1913 or 14. Demetrol had conned a photographer into betting $4,000 on his match that he told the photographer that he was going to lose. And then he ended up winning on a forfeit by the other wrestler who was mysteriously injured. The photographer realized that he had been bilked, and he went to the Chicago authorities and complained. And Demetrol was arrested for a very short time. But in a lot of these cases, the people that are the victims are also the perpetrators, because they thought that they were bilking other gamblers because they had inside information. So a lot of times these prosecutions fall apart because the victim is also the perpetrator. This time, though, they had bilked so many people, and it was to such outrageous sums of money that the victims did testify. And Marsh, knowing that he was probably going to be found guilty, pled guilty to help staging the bouts for the gambling ring. And he received a 14-month sentence and like a $1,500 fine. The ringleaders of this gambling ring were sentenced to 10 years in prison, and they were fined like $5,000 or $10,000. So Marsh does have a bad reputation, as does Demetrol. The committee, after they suspended the wrestlers and the boxers, they, like most committees, they disband after a short time. The bill in the Illinois legislature to ban professional wrestling in Illinois doesn't ever come to fruition. There was probably some political machinations behind the scene to try to make that go away. But it definitely gave the sport a black eye. And in particular, it gave Joe Stecker and Ed Strangler Lewis black eyes. And for the first time since the double cross and then Munn dropping the title recognized only in Illinois and Michigan, because Munn had been defeated legitimately by Stanislaus Zbyszko in April. After Munn drops the title back to Lewis on Memorial Day 1925, and Stanislaus Zbyszko drops the recognized, in most places, world title to Joe Stecker in St. Louis on Memorial Day 1925, they had showed no interest in wrestling each other. The California State Athletic Commission had tried to force the match at the end of 1926, and Lewis backed out of that match. They made no overtures towards each other, but after this investigation and some other threats of legal action from the federal government, for the first time, Sandow and Tony Stecker show interest in putting on the reunification match. And they start discussing terms and looking for a city to have the match at. I'm going to hop into the recommendations. You can view the show notes for this episode at kenzermanjr.com/episode 83, and I'll have a link for the match that I'm recommending this week in there. You can also, at kenzermanjr.com, you can see all the books that I've written. You can see what I'm working on. And there's like 730 posts you can look at. Not all of them are combat sports history. The majority of them are, but there's a sizable St. Louis history group of posts, a little bit of family history, and then a film post that I used to write about prior to focusing on combat sports history pretty much exclusively. The match I want to recommend this week is Lou Thesz, who is a St. Louis icon, and the first, well, he wasn't the first National Wrestling Alliance champion. The first was Orville Brown. But Orville Brown was injured in a car accident, so pretty quickly the belt goes to Lou Thesz, and he is the longtime champion from like 1949 to the 1950s. And he is wrestling in Chicago in 1951, so this is early in his title reign, against the Mighty Atlas, who is Morris Shapiro. And the Mighty Atlas is one of the few muscular wrestlers back in this day. Him and Dick the Bruiser were two of the few guys that had really good physiques. And Morris Shapiro was a Chicago standout during the early television era. So there's lots of video on the Mighty Atlas available because he was so active in Chicago at the amphitheater and the Marigold Arena. That is it for the recommendations this week. there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about wrestling news-wise, so I always give people that aren't really interested in that an opportunity to hop off at this point. If you're interested in hearing my thoughts on some of the controversies this week, I'll be sharing those over the next 5 minutes. But if you're not, I hope you enjoyed the history segment this week. Next week, I'm going to try to get because I promised a Bronco Nagurski episode, I'm going to try to get the background on that done. And I'm taking Dan his headset this week. So there's a possibility that next week's episode might be me and Dan, or it might be a combination of me, Dan, and Caleb and Trey. Bronco Nagurski is what I'm going to try to get to next week. If I can't get to that, I will probably pick a topic from the 19th century professional wrestling world to discuss next week. Wrestling news. So there's a couple of things in the news this week that I wanted to comment on. And the first one is Albert El Patron being suspended in Tijuana because he was wrestling a match for AAA. He's the AAA Mega Champion, and he's a well-known heel. And the fans were heckling him and throwing stuff at him, and he got the bright idea that he was going to jump out in the crowd, and he picks up a chair at one point and throws it at one of the fans, and the fans in the area where he's at pick up a chair and spike it right off the side of his head. He's fortunate. It didn't look like it hurt him too bad, but I tell you what, that chair came at him with a high degree of velocity and hit him on the side of the head pretty good. So he's very lucky that he wasn't seriously injured. So he comes back over the barricade after going out into the fans, which is always a foolish move. And when he comes back in, he pushes somebody. It looked like the guy who was supposed to be security at ringside, but it could have been an event organizer too. I have no idea who the person was. He was a fairly good-sized guy. And when he comes back over the thing, he pushes him like it's his fault that Albert El Patron decided to jump over the rail and throw a chair at a fan. The Tijuana Athletic Commission suspended him. Don't know how long he'll be suspended as the top guy in AAA. There'll probably be some political pressure to get him reinstated. But that was a very, very foolish thing for him to do. And he's fortunate that he or a lot of fans were not injured by something like that. John Cena's heel turn. I seem to be in the minority of people who don't like it. I can't say that it's hurting WWE business because they're still selling out everybody everywhere. People are cheering their heads off, and they're all buying his merchandise. He's out there whining at them, and they've all wearing the John Cena tour shirts and that. So it's not hurting from a business perspective, but I don't like it, and I don't have to like it. I'm going to quote Jim Ross. He was on one of the Legends of Wrestling shows, and he was talking about he didn't like the Spirit Squad. And a couple of the other panelists were trying to defend the Spirit Squad, and he was like, well, that's great, guys, but I think it sucks. That's how I kind of feel. That's great, guys. You may like it. I still think it sucks. This was not the way Cena should have went out. It still doesn't make any sense to me. And the Howdy John Cena is not getting over with me. I saved kind of the cringiest moment for last, and that is Jon Moxley landing on what looked to be a cricket bat with either a bunch of spikes in it or nails or some kind of pointed objects that he took a back suplex on and impaled into his back. And when I say impaled into his back, these nails were sticking, or spikes or whatever the heck they were sticking in his back. And you could see it on YouTube. A lot of people already have. You've probably already seen it. When they tried to pull the bat out, the nails or spikes or whatever were stuck in his skin, and you could see his skin being stretched. That had to be extremely painful. And my reaction to it was just another unnecessary spot, and it didn't lead anything. It was a spot. He got suplexed onto that. It stuck in his back. It took a while for them to get it out of his back, but then he won the match. I think these spots turn the fans off. So the whole Death Riders thing, which has been the top storyline in AEW now for 6 months to a year, it's not bringing your fans back. You've got the same 500 to 700,000 fans that watch your show every week. You might even be turning some of them off. The only thing I've seen the fans get excited about lately is Toni Storm and her Timeless character. And the first time you see the Death Riders, because I experienced this, I saw them when I had Max a couple months ago. And the first time you see them, they look like a pretty impressive group. And then it starts getting NWO old very, very quickly. They come out, they kick the hell out of the baby faces every week. And you start thinking, how stupid are the baby faces in AEW that they get their butts kicked every week? So this thing is not getting over. Somebody going on a bat like that, people may look at that just to go, oh, wow. But that's not going to attract casual fans or lapsed professional wrestling fans from coming back to watch your product. So you can keep doing the things that you're doing if you're very satisfied with 500 to 700,000 fans. And whenever you do stuff like this, you're also taking the chance on offending the network. They've not shown any inclination so far, at least it seems, to kind of rein these guys in. But eventually they may. So you're taking a chance on losing your TV deal. You're taking a chance on turning fans off. And it's really a meaningless spot because it didn't lead to anything. Moxley didn't lose the match. Moxley wasn't taken out on a stretcher. He just basically had somebody pull it out of his back, screamed, and went and beat Adam Copeland. Tony needs to hire a couple producers to start putting an end to some of this ridiculous things that these guys are wanting to do. Learn a lesson from WCW. After 2 years of the NWO just kicking the hell out of the baby faces every week, people were sick of the NWO. People were just thought the baby faces were the dumbest people on the face of this earth, and they were no longer interested in the show. Enough said about that unnecessary spot. Well, that's it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. In the next episode, I am hoping to get the band back together, but that just depends on how quickly I can get Dan the headset and get him set up on his laptop. The KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. You can also see what I'm working on currently and a list of books that I have written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling. Thank you for listening. I would be grateful if you would leave a review for this podcast wherever you listen to it, iTunes or Podbean, Podcast Addict. There's a million different places and ways to listen nowadays. But that helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. And if you have already done this, thank you so much. Until next week, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.